Hi, my name is Lisa Fernandez, and welcome to today's talk. Welcome to the Yale Center for Environmental Communication. This is our first public event of the spring semester. Thanks for joining us. The Yale Center for Environmental Communication, or YCEC for short, is an initiative of the Yale School of the Environment. There are 4 pillars to our work. The first is that we conduct research on the psychological, cultural, and political factors that influence environmental attitudes and behavior. The second pillar is that we teach courses for Yale students and conduct trainings for working professionals. Thirdly, we inform and engage the public through environmental journalism. One example is Yale Climate Connections, our climate change news service that includes a radio program broadcast daily on more than 650 stations nationwide. It is focused on solutions to global warming and how everyday people are addressing global warming in their own lives. We also host Yale E360, an online magazine featuring reporting, opinion, and analysis on global environmental issues, and several student-run initiatives longstanding at the school, like Sage Magazine, a literary and arts publication, EFFI, the annual environmental film festival at Yale, and Yale Environmental Review, which translates cutting-edge environmental research for a lay audience. Finally, YCEC's 4th pillar is convening and catalyzing a global network of organizations seeking to build public and political will for environmental solutions. And the talk today is really an example of that convening function. Firstly, if you check out the chat, I've put the link in there to the book that first drew our attention to the amazing photographers that have joined us today. It's titled Human Nature, Planet Earth in Our Time, and is published by Jeff Blackwell and Ruth Hobday, and is available from Chronicle Books. It's really, truly a stunning book. So just a few items for housekeeping before we get going. Please hold your questions until after all 3 photographers have had a chance to present their work, including a discussion afterwards that'll be between Anthony Leisowitz, the moderator, and the photographers. So we'll open up Q&A hopefully for the last quarter of the hour. And also, please, you're all muted. Please go ahead and put your questions into the chat whenever they occur to you. We will select from them to respond during the Q&A. And now I'd like to turn it over to my boss, Tony Leisowitz, the director of YCEC and a senior research scientist at YSE. He'll moderate this entire session going forward. He's a pretty passionate amateur photographer himself and first put forward the idea of inviting the 3 gentlemen here today to speak about their work. Tony, take it away.
Thanks, Lisa, and welcome everybody to our first lecture of the spring. Really excited to bring to you 3 of the world's top photographers who've contributed to what is really a stunning book. And I really do hope people click through and take a look and hopefully even purchase it. I will just say historically in the field of what we would call environmental communication, coffee table books on the environment have been really, really key to a number of advances and protection of critical landscapes and so on. So there's a long, rich history of the power of the image to affect how we perceive the world, how we think about the world, and how ultimately we as individuals and collectively as societies respond to these issues. Because fundamentally, human beings are an incredibly visual species. And I will just say as a quick note of introduction that while certainly here in our academic centers, we tend to focus on the written word and the number as a way of doing analysis and describing and communicating about these problems, people are fundamentally visual. And that's why the way that we depict the world and the particular images we use to characterize issues like climate change or species biodiversity extinctions and so on are so important in terms of engaging the larger public, because they not only convey the reality of these issues, but they bring the emotional meaning of these issues as well. And so today we're incredibly fortunate to have 3 of the world's top photographers talking about the images that they contributed to this book. And then as we get in the Q&A, we'll talk a little bit more about their experience of making these kinds of images and also what kind of impact they have found these images tend to have. So with that, we're going to jump right in because we have limited time. And we're going to start with a presentation by Steve Winter, Full bios, by the way, are already available to you through the links that we provided. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but let's just say these are all amazing photographers with incredible careers. To very briefly introduce Steve. Steve Winter has been a photographer for National Geographic for over 2 decades. He's a Nat Geo Explorer, which is a really special group, a special club within Nat Geo. And he's been named the BBC Wildlife Photographer of the Year and BBC Wildlife Photojournalist of the Year in prior years. So with that, Steve, over to you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. And thank you for inviting all of us here. Next. Oh, it works. Yay. Listen, this first image talks about the first big cat story I ever worked on. It was the first jaguar story for National Geographic. So in 107 years, Nat Geo had never done a story on jaguars before. So I started it out using remote cameras in the jungle and became incredibly unsuccessful. Went to Cancun to fly to Brazil, found this tourism operation and got this great picture that drew people into jaguars. Next. When I finally got to Brazil, I found out that in the Pantanal, there was a lot of jaguars, but all the cowboys down there, it was 95% privately owned, mostly cattle ranchers, thought the only good jaguar was a dead jaguar. Next. So I had to create images to help show this. And it was good I had situations like this when I saw a jaguar rug in a ranch house and was able to put this on a fence post and show this image that they thought the only good jaguar was a dead jaguar. The scientist I was working with, her boss was my best friend. We were able to get funds for the first ever GPS sat college study of jaguars and found that only 1% of cattle deaths could be attributed to jaguars. So that helped bring about change. Next, I went back about 10 years later and found out that most of all the cattle ranches had turned into ecotourism lodges because they could make more money off of tourism than cattle ranching. Then a paper came out when I was there for the second jaguar story and a film for Nat Geo Wild on jaguars that each cow was worth $2,000 in its lifetime, but each jaguar brought in $108,000 every year in ecotourism funds, so no jaguars would ever be killed. Next. So tourism helped make this the only oasis for jaguars there was. Next. I did the last Nat Geo tiger story, and I wanted to cover the Sumatran tiger, subspecies that had never really been covered. So I went to Sumatra and found out that because of the influx of all these people from Java working in palm oil, they would be given 10 hectares of land, put snares up, and snares are indiscriminate. So this young cub spent 4 days in a snare and lost its right front leg. And because of this image, his snares were outlawed. But just because they make a law doesn't mean it's enforced. So the image was powerful for people, but you know, you need that enforcement for things to actually work properly. But you can see the emotion on this cub's face. Thank you. Here's the Thai Tiger Temple. I was working in Thailand on the Indo-Chinese tiger and heard about a place that the scientist said to me, don't go there. We think they're involved in the black market trade. And I was like, well, if you think so, what are you going to do about it? This picture ran in Nat Geo. It garnered interest. Next. A few years later, my partner journalist Sharon Guinup and I went back. I did a 7-minute video for natgeo.com. Sharon wrote 4 stories with information from undercover sources that helped show the government that they were involved in the black market breeding and trade of cubs to Laos, Vietnam, and China. After her 4th story and 5 months, the government went in with the army and police, confiscated all 178 tigers, and closed down the largest tiger tourism operation in Thailand, which put a flag up for the rest of these operations in Southeast Asia. Next. Now, I was asked by a friend of mine, why have you never worked in the US before, Steve? And I said, well, Howard Quigley, well, I don't know. I've never had an opportunity. So why don't you do a story on cougars? So I worked on the Teton Cougar Project in outside of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And then he said, you know, you should go to LA because they have a population of cougars there. So I went to a mountain lion meeting in Bozeman, Montana to talk to the National Park Service biologist who was working here. I asked him a few questions because I needed that incredible shot of, and I asked him, do you have any trails where cougars walk with the lights of LA in the background? And he kept saying no to every question I asked him. So I said, do you know how we could really tell this story? And I said, to show a mountain lion with the Hollywood sign. And he looked at me like I was crazy. He said, there's no cougars in Griffith Park. And I said, well, if anything changes, here's my card. Let me know. 8 months later, I get a text in all caps with a bunch of exclamation points saying, call me now. On their Bobcat study cameras, I got a picture of a cougar. And then I had to figure out how to put these remote cameras in downtown LA without them getting stolen. And after 15 months, next, there is the image. It came from an idea just from a talk with a biologist. And with that image, it garnered a lot of support in LA. And now next, they have a P22 day in LA, and they're building the largest wildlife overpass in the world because of the two images that I got. Next. National Geographic is the #1 brand on social media in the world, and images that have a negative impact can move people to change on social media. In 24 hours, this image got 2.2 million likes and helped bring funding for the tree climbing lions of Uganda to help stop snaring, which is the largest problem in many instances for lions and other big cats. Next. Now, in December 2019, Sharon, my partner, journalist Sharon Guinup, Woodrow Wilson Fellow Sharon Guinup, she's a Nat Geo writer and a Nat Geo explorer. We did a story on the fact that there's more tigers in the United States than there are in the wild. So we had to delve into this underworld that many of you saw on Tiger King on Netflix, because there are more tigers in the US than there are in the wild, and it's primarily used for next cub petting operations because these are incredibly lucrative. We saw one operation make $50,000 in one day just on cub petting. Next. This is the #1 breeder, in my estimation, Doc Antel at Myrtle Beach Safari. The cubs are bred, they're taken away at birth, so they're never with their mother, and they're only used between 3 and 4 months. So one of our jobs was to find out what happens to them when they're too big to pet. You can't use them past maybe 16 weeks because they're too dangerous to hold, because you have small children using them also. And our story really garnered a lot of support to the fact that for $40, you can get tiger cubs a license to have tigers from USDA. But because of all the things that were going on next, USDA got back involved because even mutt tigers like the ones in these locations were now considered on the endangered species list. So they went into Joe Exotics and dug up the 5 tigers they had heard he had shot to make more space for younger tigers. So my job here was, how do you take a picture of these 5 skulls? And the undercover agents pulled up the garage door here, and I said, stop, because there was my picture. Next. And because of the interest in the story, the Big Cat Public Safety Act was passed in Congress last fall, and now it again is in. And they're looking at the fact that this is incredibly dangerous for first responders when there's a hurricane or a tornado. Fences blow down. Tigers will go to a secure location. So this is a photo illustration using a stuffed tiger of what would happen, because they go into places and houses in Houston in the last hurricane, and a tiger runs at them. They open a church door and a lion runs at them. And so many of these places next go into true sanctuaries, like the Wild Animal Sanctuary in Colorado, the largest sanctuary in the world, where these animals are kept for life, given proper nutrition and vet care. Thank you very much.
Wow, well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Steve. A lot of incredibly rich material there. Can't wait to get into the Q&A. And by the way, just to remind everyone, if you have questions for our photographers, please drop them into the chat. We'll be drawing from that when we get to the Q&A part of the conversation. Okay, so next up is Henry Fair. Henry uses pictures to tell stories about people and things that affect people. He's based in New York City and in Berlin. And his recent book is called Industrial Scars, The Hidden Costs of Consumption, which was published by Papadakis of London, and it's in its second edition. So this will be something very different, but a different visual look at the impact of human beings on the planet. And with that, over to you, Henry.
Thank you, Tony. Next. So what I do is I photograph the irony of being a sentient human in the modern consumer world. And I'd like to start with a little story about taking a road trip with God, who, I might inform you, drives an old Volvo station wagon. Next, but first, a word from our sponsors. Natural gas, safe, clean energy. Next, for America's energy security future. Next. So next, God, it turns out, is named James Hansen. He is the god of the climate crisis. In 1988, Hansen stood up in front of Congress and told the world that NASA was 99% certain that human-caused emissions were going to cause a crisis in our climate. Next. And of course, we paid close attention and acted accordingly, and the world is a better place because of it. Next. I use sarcasm and irony continually. Forgive me. So our question is, can art change the world? What is art? Next. I would warrant that art is emotional manipulation. The artist wants people to feel something. The artist feels something and wants people also to feel it. Let's look at Goya, let's look at Bach, let's look at Vladimir Nabokov, let's look at Goya. These artists felt very deeply about something and wanted to make their viewers, their readers, feel the same way. Next. So I make ironically beautiful, disturbing images of toxic waste. I want viewers to feel uncomfortable. Next. Because of course, we're all participants in the destruction that is destroying the complex systems that bring us life. Next. Safe, clean energy for America's future. Hydrofracking. Next. So I started with a desire to change the world. And slowly I started working with environmental groups and scientists and universities to tell stories about how what we were doing as consumers was destroying the natural web that we depend on for life. Next. So one of my first projects was to go with NRDC and Greenpeace Germany to the Kenogami National Forest in Canada, which was being deforested next to make, you guessed it, your favorite facial tissue. And this project was very successful. And in fact, it got the multinational corporation paper company, which makes your favorite facial tissue and toilet paper, to commit to changing their sourcing behavior. And that's a major accomplishment. Of course, it needed all of the components. It needed the images, it needed the environmental groups, and it needed the public. It needed the public to act. Next. So one of the battles I'm fighting now is probably unknown to many of you, and that is the use of biomass for electricity. The idea sounds great. Next. We burn scrap paper and scrap wood and use it in our old coal-fired power plants to make electricity. But in fact, next, there's not enough scrap paper and scrap wood. So we are rapidly deforesting the Southeast United States to power the power plants of Europe. And because of complex climate rules, this is subsidized. The Europeans are subsidizing the cutting down of American forests to power their power plants. They're giving tax credits to these utilities to do it. So the Europeans and some Americans are paying to cut down our old growth forests. Next. Another project I'm working on is coastlines, looking at coastlines, both what's there and what we can expect to come, because of course, that is the cutting edge of the ocean rise crisis. This is the Deepwater Horizon spill. Next. And of course, one of the sub battles of that is the desire on the part of oil companies and politicians to drill off of the east coast of the United States. So I partner with, and I'll partner with anybody, with a Republican, with a Democrat, if they want to move my battle forward, I'm with them. These images I gave to a Republican in South Carolina who was able to pass a law preventing offshore drilling off of South Carolina. Next. As you all know, I assume you're on this talk, so you're aware of the fact that the ocean is rising. It's risen over a foot in the last 100 years. So all coastal cities are at risk. This is London. The Brits, in their wonderful way, built a barrier to protect London from storm surges barreling down the North Sea. And I timed it on the day when they were testing their gates, and you can see it here. It's called the Thames Barrier, and it protects the financial capital of London from storm surges coming up the Thames. Next. And of course, by the way, if one looks at New York City, it is the same. We are a coastal city and we're in dire threat from ocean rise. But I want to go back to that idea of we must motivate public action. And this is my last story. This is a brown coal mine in Germany called Hambach. It is the largest hole in Germany, and the coal from this power plant powers the largest carbon emitters in Germany, and they're also the largest emitters of mercury, uranium, and dioxin, which are emitted by all power plants that burn coal. Next. It also happens that there's the last ancient forest in Germany, which is on the southern end of this coal mine and being progressively cut by the company that owns the coal mine and the power plants. This is the encampment of a very brave group of young men and women from around Europe who have been living in that forest for the last 15 years, trying to raise the alarm to stop what's happening. It's horrible. You can see a progression of it. Greenpeace has a wonderful satellite progression of the cutting of the Hambach forest. It'll break your heart. In spite of the fact that the forest is now the size of Manhattan, next, it still contains 6 species listed on the EU endangered species list. So this is one of the excavators digging the brown coal in that hole, which is the largest hole in Europe. And so in 2018, I was doing a big exhibit at the Museum of Natural History, Berlin, and I started to see, I've photographed this mine over the last 15 years. And when we were preparing for this exhibit, I started to see signs all around Berlin, which said, with a chainsaw, which said, Hambi bleibt, which is a short for Hambach stays, meaning we must stop the cutting. Next. So again, they're cutting down the forest to make room for the mine to continue. So this is the beautiful abstract expressionist shot, which made it into the exhibit. And what happened is this: even though they've been trying, activists have been trying for 15 years to stop the progression of this mine, it took public opinion. And in the summer of 2018, there was a social media storm, my exhibit in Berlin, and a bunch of wonderful activists, culminating in September when 50,000 Europeans responded to that uprising of vocal and social media engagement and walked into this forest in September 2018, at which point a court in Cologne stopped the cutting of the forest, therefore stopping the progress of the mine, therefore cutting off the fuel to those power plants, the largest climate emitters in Europe. So we must motivate people to act. We must fight apathy. Thank you very much. That's it. I'm done.
Yes. Well, thank you, Henry. Fabulous photographs. And we're going to come back to that theme of the tension between the beauty of these photographs and the emotional reaction once you understand what they are of. And I think so far, both of you have really touched on that and exemplified that really interesting tension very, very nicely. Okay, so we're going to move on to our last guest. That's Tim Lehman. Tim is a contributing photographer at National Geographic and also has contributed to films from the BBC Natural History Unit and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And he's an associate of Harvard University's Museum of Comparative Zoology. So now we're going to get another look, a very different look at these kinds of issues. So with that, Tim, over to you.
All right, thanks, Tony. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I tend to focus more on the sort of beauty of nature and trying to inspire people to care about our planet and endangered species. And I've worked a lot in Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific rainforests like you see here in Borneo. Next. One of the main species that I've focused on over a good part of my career is the orangutan. There are 3 species of orangutans in Sumatra and Borneo. They're all critically endangered, and I've been working closely with researchers, including my wife, Cheryl Knott at Boston University and many others, and working with NGOs that, next please, that are working to conserve orangutans, to tell the stories about them and help people learn more and be more aware about orangutans and their plight. I mean, these are the great apes. They're some of our closest relatives. They're really species that are flagship species for conserving all the biodiversity in the rainforest in that region. And so I've done National Geographic stories starting from back in way back in 1998. My first one, I've done 3 National Geographic articles and a series of other media outputs related to orangutans. And in more recent years, besides just focusing on the sort of natural history and biology, I have started to also obviously cover the issues that they're facing, right? Like you see here, clear cutting and burning of the forest to plant oil palm and other agricultural crops. So I've kind of changed from sort of a biologist background where I was really interested in the natural history, telling those stories, to like my other colleagues, also telling the story of the issues and combining the two together. So besides what's happening to the habitat, next, what happens to the orangutans when the forests are cleared is that they come into more contact with people. It's very tempting for people to, capture babies for pets, but this may be a cute picture and is designed to engage the viewer, but I need to get people to read the caption or listen to the story behind it, because these, 8 baby orangutans in a wheelbarrow reflects sort of 8 dead mothers in the wild. And orangutans that will never grow up to live. They may be raised by people in captivity at a care center or something, but they will never have the knowledge they need next to survive in the wild, because orangutans, need to grow up with a mother who knows how to get around in the forest and knows what to eat, and learns everything there is to be about orangutan to be able to survive. So next, please. So I'm, continuing to document the lives of wild orangutans. I worked really hard to get this shot. It required a lot of tree climbing, rigging remote cameras. But what I wanted to do was to show an orangutan in its habitat, and creating images that really capture people's attention. Like you've seen from Steve and Henry as well, we put a lot of work into these images and trying to create artistic images, meaningful images, impactful images, because those are the ones that get seen. To get a picture into National Geographic or into a prominent exhibition, or just to get a lot of attention on social media, it's all about the quality of imagery is so important. And so just any old picture of an orangutan doesn't have nearly as much impact as something like this. So that's just a point I wanted to make, is that quality doesn't matter in environmental photography. Now, a second story that I worked on for National Geographic more recently was on helmeted hornbills, and this is an example of something that I was brought to. This is by conservationists who realized that this amazing bird, that's one of the largest in the Southeast Asian rainforests, and has this amazing breeding habits, next slide, of sealing. The female seals herself into a tree cavity. The male brings all the food to feed her during a several-month period. So this was a fascinating, amazing bird, but they have become critically endangered just in the last 10 years due to serious market hunting, and they're being hunted for the casque on their head, that horn-like helmet on their head. They're called the helmeted hornbill. And so I follow this story from, next slide, from the hunters who I connected with deep in the remote parts of Borneo, who hunt this species and other species of hornbills that you see here. I followed them all the way to, next slide, to markets in Shanghai to find the products that were for sale in the markets there. And really, it's kind of the burgeoning economy in China. This has been a traditional kind of artifact that people have collected there for centuries, but now with kind of well-funded hunters with guns, they're decimating this bird. So next slide. I even was able to go to U.S. Customs, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, where they've confiscated all these carvings that are trying to be smuggled into the United States. So we need these kind of images that show the problems, as well as, next slide, as well as the, showing the bird in the wild to get people to appreciate it. And what we're trying to do here, besides the National Geographic article that was, of course, published in English, but also in Chinese, in the Chinese edition, we created a video about this issue and about the hornbill, helmeted hornbill. that also we translate into Chinese and are distributed through various Chinese conservation groups. Because here, we have to reach the audience, the customer base, who are creating the demand for this product in order to really sort of put a stop to the market. And one sort of positive spinoff from COVID has actually been an increase in enforcement and clampdown on wildlife trafficking laws in China because of the connection with COVID and wildlife. So that is seeing some positive trend there. But really getting that message out is so important. So here's just a map I wanted to show of forest loss in the last 20 years across the big islands of Southeast Asia, the Pacific region, Sumatra, Borneo. You see all that orange, that's all forest that's lost in the last 20 years, which is where the orangutans live, where those helmeted hornbills live. It's why they're all, one of the reasons that they're critically endangered. But notice, I want to point you over to New Guinea, that huge island of New Guinea, which is just above Australia. Second biggest island in the world. It's mostly still black there, which means still good forest. Next slide. And so one of the things I want to talk about in my last little section here is, how do we get attention for things to conserve the forest and the wildlife, the biodiversity of our planet before we're at the critically endangered stage? And New Guinea is a great example of that because there's over 85% forest there. It's a huge amount of forest. It's so important for global carbon stores. But people don't really think about it that much. Everybody's heard of the Amazon and the Congo, and in Asia, in the Asia Pacific, New Guinea is by far the biggest, forest block left. So I've been using the story of the birds of paradise. Next slide. For the last 15, 20 years, I've been making journeys to New Guinea region, and birds of paradise here. This is the opening spread from my first article in Geographic on the birds of paradise back in 2007. And next slide. I've been telling the story of this group of birds, which is kind of the most charismatic, wildlife subject in the New Guinea region, right? There are over 40 species. They're really interesting biologically because they're an example of sexual selection by female choice that has led to all these incredible forms in the males. Next slide. And so, I've been doing several articles, a couple for the Geographic, many other magazines, done films for National Geographic, the BBC, Netflix, Our Planet, and we've created YouTube videos about the birds of paradise that have over 20 million views. So, we're getting the message out there. I think people are getting more aware of these birds and hopefully where they come from, and especially one positive thing, next slide, is that the West Papua government, the government of the western half of New Guinea, island of New Guinea, which is part of Indonesia, they've really latched on to the idea of being a green province. They're hoping that they can get maybe some kind of carbon credits or, benefits for keeping their province as forest. And so they're using my imagery in their campaigns. I can't point to too many specific examples as like Steve and Henry were able to of like exact outcomes. It's hard to measure when you're creating a lot of media and hopefully creating awareness. I think it's really worth doing, but it's not always easy to measure the outcome. That's something that I'm, interested in trying to figure out how to track better, and maybe can learn from you guys. But next slide. Let's close with this image here. Sometimes I do get sort of anecdotes that come back to me that are very satisfying. This is one of my favorite images and one of my most widely published ones of this greater bird of paradise overlooking the rainforest in the Aru Islands. This is a big island just south of New Guinea that I went to and made this image back in 2011. And a couple of years ago, there was a huge government multinational corporation kind of scheme to basically lease most of this island, more than half of this island, to a sugar cane company. They were just going to clear cut it and put sugarcane in. And the local people found out about it. They mobilized, they partnered with some Indonesian nonprofits and started an international campaign to block this. And they use this image and some others as their main kind of to get people's attention of, what we could lose if we don't pay attention. And so, I think images like this of the beauty of our world, the natural world, that convey what we may lose are also a real important part of the whole picture of what we can do as photographers to advance our cause of taking care of our planet. So I'll leave it there, and thanks very much.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you, Tim. And thanks to all of you for sharing these and by the way, this is just a tiny selection of careers of fabulous images from all of them. So we really appreciate your sharing them with us and your stories. So with that said, let me remind you again, everyone listening, if you have questions, please drop them into the chat and we'll draw from them. But in the meantime, let me at least get us started with a conversation with a theme that I think shows up throughout all of these. And in fact, it's really one of the central themes of the book that you all participated in and you all contributed to, the human nature intersection. And so, I'm going to be academic for a second, is that, here in the United States, we've long had this both wonderful and troubled relationship with the natural world here in the US, which has often pitted human society and nature, most notably the idea of wilderness, as opposite things. Wilderness is where people are and people are, and either people and so civilization is a good thing, or then it ultimately became cast as a bad thing, and so on. And so this has always been a kind of particularly American view of the world, which has been in fact exported around the world with lots of both positive and negative consequences. But one of the things that I find really interesting about this book and all of your work, and I'm hoping you'll comment a bit more about it, is this fundamental question of how do we make the invisible visible? And in particular, what I'm really struck by all of your photos is that they're helping us find that these spheres of the world are not in fact separate, that humans are found where these animals and these plants and these landscapes are, but likewise, those species are showing up in our cities and in our own environments too. And in particular, I was struck by the images that help depict the connections. In other words, how do you go from seeing the species in the wild to then tracing, or the resource in the wild, like the photos of the coal mine, and being able to trace that entire pathway, that entire set of connections that are very real and affecting people and species and landscapes at every step of what business people call the value chain, until they ultimately end up as a discrete object, say in a market in the United States or China, which is invisible to all of us, right? I mean, it's the same thing that happens in agriculture today. If you go to the grocery store and you buy a piece of chicken, it's nicely sanitized, it's clean, there's no blood, there's nothing that tells you that this was once a living being. It's nicely wrapped up in plastic and easy for you to take home and just use as another food source. So in many ways, our civilization and our societies have been built to actually disguise or to remove our ability to see these connection points, to see these pathways by the which we draw on the natural world. And of course, we then impact the natural world. So with that idea, how do we make the invisible visible, especially these connection points? I'm hoping that you might just reflect a bit about your own work and how it relates to that. Any of you want to volunteer first, or should I go around?
Well, I'll go. That's really my my métier, and my answer is we must engage the public. And I think we're fighting an info war, to borrow a phrase, and we are being, and that's why I dropped in my little quote about natural gas, safe, clean energy. Well, in fact, it's not safe, clean energy. It has as much climate impact as coal, but that's not what we're told. So we in the environmental world do another study and throw some numbers at people. People don't respond. The advertising world throws some comforting words and video images at people about, we're making your world safe. And who do people want to listen to? And I think the gist of that is we need, every science budget should be 20% about science communication, because we can do all the science we want. Aka James Hansen, 1988, and we've done nothing in 50 years. We've gone worse. So we need science communication. in a way that people can understand. With images, as you said at the beginning, Tony, people respond to images.
Yeah, I think that it's one of the reasons that I wanted to work on things like the Hollywood cougar, the leopards of Mumbai that you didn't see, is because these things shock people. And, you know, when you get a whole community and the mayor of LA, or the LA school districts mandating things about wildlife corridors be taught in the school system, and people go, that cougar's there first. They don't want to go to Griffith Park again, but there's 24 million people that go there every year. So find these connections so people, because we've gotten so far away from nature, but everyone does value it. They do understand, why do you take a walk in the woods? Why do you go to Griffith Park and get away from the noises and the horns and the everything? You can't get away from the helicopters, though. But for people to realize that the health of ecosystems, animals, and humans are inextricably linked. We do see that now with COVID and where we think COVID came from in wildlife wet markets in China. But give people a reason to care and give them something they've never seen before. That invisible part that you were talking about, Tony. And that was something that I wanted to do, because first it amazed me, and then we can bring connections to the public that we are connected to nature.
Yeah, just kind of on that note, I'll just make a comment that one thing I found encouraging, and that is, I think, kind of one of the benefits, the real benefits of social media in the last 10 years is in Indonesia, where I've done a lot of my work. It's really great to see how much engagement there is by mostly young, I'm assuming, but, you know, Indonesians on social media, whether I'm posting a picture of if I post a picture of a forest fire in Borneo, there'll be all these people on there like tagging their president, saying, hey, President, Jokowi, we need to stop the fires,
Yeah.
Or if I post a picture of an orangutan, people are celebrating that. They're saying, oh, that's from Indonesia. That's, we love orangutans. So, I mean, I'm seeing so much more engagement of young people. I think having access to that communication device that reaches everybody is so important. We should really take advantage of that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, I'm sorry, did you want to say something else, Tim?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So that's really great. And I want to just then pick up on, I think, a theme related to this that Henry just raised, and that is that in fact, this is an information war. And that, in fact, those, especially companies, and I'll pick out the fossil fuel industry in particular, I mean, they don't just make, rational arguments with numbers and words and studies and so on. They spend hundreds of millions, in fact, billions of dollars to try to communicate their point of view. And they're always very targeted at the emotions. So it's not just great images, but it's trying to affect our perceptions, our emotional reactions to them as companies and their products, of course. So I'm hoping that you could now take this next step to just talk a little bit more about how, and maybe you don't actually do this consciously, and I'm assuming you probably don't. You're in the end, you're totally in the moment of capturing these images. But in the end, what are the emotional reactions that you think that your work has been able to activate in viewers and in your audiences? And how does that then relate to change in the world?
All right, do we follow the same order?
Sure, whatever.
So I, in fact, do purposefully, when I'm making pictures, draw on the human perception models that the Renaissance artists developed. How do we perceive? What do our eyes see? How does it connect to our brain? And I purposefully create images while I'm doing it, which are engaging, which talk to people through those pathways that, Michelangelo and these great painters forged. They figured out, okay, how do we make a visual image that moves people? And I'm also big on linking science in everyday language in simple, comforting tones to the pictures. Again, irony, and trying to get a complex message to people who are too busy in their lives, and they're not really interested in not having that plastic wrapped chicken, right, ready at the supermarket. And they don't really want to think about, okay, the fecal matter from that chicken, which was grown on the Del Mar Peninsula, is destroying the Chesapeake Bay. Okay, they don't really want to think about that. So we got to kind of nudge them, there's that great word nudge, into behavior that will preserve the natural world for their children.
I think that we somehow need to forge these new connections with nature, and we can do that in small ways. I think social media, as Tim was saying, is vitally important. I mean, National Geographic, the main Instagram account, has 150 million followers. We're the #1 brand in the world. I mean, you can reach people, and I found that it works both ways. I was super shocked when that picture of the lioness with the snare around her face garnered so much support, because usually negative pictures people don't want to see. That's turning around. Those connections are being created in people's minds that, yes, something positive came out of this, when in the past, in many instances, I was looking for pictures that people had never seen before. Because I also, and it was a way to keep furthering going from one story to the next at National Geographic, but I saw it making a difference. People do care, and so we start individually, kids in schools. People say that are of the voting age, what's the #1 thing I can do to help? And I always say vote. But with young kids doing things in school, being involved on social media, and creating this small little seed in their own selves that expands more from their school into their communities and gets bigger and bigger. So give them something positive to look at, but understand that if there's a positive connection to something negative, that can actually work also, and that we all are connected to this planet. We've heard this for forever, but we have to realize that this planet is perfection. Nature is perfection, gives us the air we need to breathe and the water we need to grow our crops and to drink. And we need to keep that. And a lot of young people now are understanding these connections much better than I think we did in the past.
I will just briefly echo, what Henry said, and what you're referring to, the InfoWars and the well-funded machine learning that you mentioned from the fossil fuel industry. I think, a more concerted effort from the scientific community, the media, to like organizations like National Geographic, we can do a lot more to get our message out, especially in social media. Like, we mostly do our social media on our own free time. There's not a concerted plan. So I think that's an area to think about, improving funding for science and environmental communication. If we're going to fight the info wars, we need to do it properly. So, but yeah, everything you guys have said, I agree with.
Yeah,
I'd like to throw something in there. I think a lot of proposals have been put forward, but I think that if a company is going to be awarded a broadcast license, that they need to be held accountable to fact and truth. And I know that's a difficult thing and would require censorship, but as long as we have major media that are broadcasting visible untruths into the homes of big portions of the population, we're not going to win any battles.
So this is fantastic. Thank you, guys. I think I'm going to turn to the chat for one last question, which I think you just touched on a little bit, but I actually want to draw you out a little bit more on. And that is, the question is, do you find that the context in which your images are presented, whether it's social media, print, books, museums, impact the interpretation of your work greatly, or do they seem to promote action more than others? And that might actually just be a bit of a runway back to that last point about the increasing importance of social media as a way to get these images out at scale, because that's the fundamental thing. Coffee books are great. They're lovely. But in the end, there's only so many of them, and you can only get them on so many coffee tables. And frankly, who has coffee tables anymore? So anyway, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about that, because each of you have, look, you've managed to work with some of the biggest media platforms on the planet, National Geographic, BBC, et cetera. But even so, we're still struggling in this backdrop of we're all being inundated by literally thousands of advertisements every day, and that's let alone all the other content that we're exposed to. So just wondering if you could say a little bit more about how best to get these images and these ideas out at scale.
Well, social media is key, but of course, and as Steve said, National Geographic, biggest social media brand in the world. It's fantastic. And you got to love the direction they're moving, which is more and more about environmentalism. But as long as people, now back to my story about the Hambach brown coal mine, that's owned by one of the largest energy companies in the world. They own power plants in America as well. And there's a wonderful advertisement by them of a jolly green giant traipsing over the countryside, planting windmills, and then he goes into the water and plants a water wheel generator. Now, you and I know that those don't even exist yet, but that's what that's what people are seeing. They're seeing the lies, which are funded by millions and millions of dollars, and we'll never fight that. If we could pass a truth in broadcast regulation, I think that would be major. If we can get a broadcaster to be penalized if they broadcast an untruth or lose their license, that would go a long way.
Yeah, I think getting these environmental ideas out there and getting people to react to them, that we actually are seeing now in a big way with the new administration here, and they're really pushing climate change. I think that's vitally important, and that we're seeing people take action. Now, we have these big platforms, but you need people to believe in it, not just watch the nature programs because they love seeing animals. They have to understand the connections that this planet works as a perfect living organism. And I really do believe that these things are moving forward in a way, and we just need to somehow believe in truth and find ironic ways to talk about the truth of science to people. Well, if you believe this, why don't you believe this? Because we need to make connections that will make a difference to people's everyday lives about science. I always thought that your parents didn't tell you to get an F in science when you went to school, so obviously you believed your science teacher. Is that correct? We were, where is this disconnect? And make new connections that make logical sense to people, because it's just these broad, don't believe in this, this is not happening. No, we live on a living organism that has to function properly. Like our bodies, if one of our major organs don't work, guess what? There's a good chance we're going to die, and the same things about the planet. Tim.
Hey, yeah, Tony, to the question about which of the, I think one of the question was about the different platforms and how they which are the most valuable. And I think really they all work together. Like, I think it's important you can't just only do social media. Social media can feed attention to a film or an exhibition or something where you can go and spend more time and get more information, get really, I've been encouraged that a lot of the big broadcasters like National Geographic, BBC, Netflix, like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I was involved in films projects where we were pushing the idea of, let's get a conservation message into this film. And there was always a pushback, like, oh, people don't want to watch that. That'll be a turn off. That's really changed. You know, you see these like biggest films on Netflix, like Our Planet series, having like every episode ends with like a really strong conservation message, and then they have another whole hour on, you know, on conservation issues, and people are watching those. So I think that's encouraging. I think we're moving in the right direction in terms of the media world and covering these issues. And yeah, I mean, I agree with, you know, Stephen Henry's points about, you know, we have to get get rid of the false information out there, and that's difficult to combat. But I am encouraged that you know, social media is really reaching a wider audience around the world than ever before. Yeah. And these, you know, the big media companies like Nat Geo and others are sort of taking it more seriously, that it's their job to like get the truth out there. So I think, you know, we're going to keep moving in that direction. It'd be good.
Well, thank you all. Unfortunately, this is a conversation that we literally could go all afternoon with. We don't have all afternoon. But I just want to emphasize a couple critical points that you just said there. Is first of all, you know, what I think is so special about your work is that you're making these abstract issues very concrete for people. You're helping us see other parts of the world, or even address major issues that are very difficult, like what the hell is climate change? Okay, what should we have in our head when we think of climate change? It's actually something we study, and we know that most people think of like melting icebergs, and not people, not all the subsequent consequences that climate change is happening for us all around the world. That's not an accident. It's because we've been exposed to those pictures of melting glaciers over and over and over and over and over and over again. And so I think what you're alluding to is that we're beginning to finally diversify our library, our repertoire, our visual vocabulary of what climate change is and all of these other issues. And really, all three of you have been at the forefront of bringing these new ideas, these new mental images to all of us. So on behalf of everybody here at the School of the Environment and the Yale Center for Environmental Communication, I want to thank you very much for your work. Everybody that's online, please go check out the book, Human Nature. It's just gorgeous. You saw just an appetizer here of the many, many other images that are there from these gentlemen and their colleagues. And with that, thank you again for joining us today.